Now, starting Reimagining the Role of XR in Education, a speaker presentation by Jody Parchment, CEO of Dream Steam Labs, an edtech company. She also is an XR developer at OnXr.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm excited to speak to you guys about the role that XR is playing in education, actually reimagining the role that XR is playing in education, and why there is such hesitancy to adopting this innovation. When I was younger, we didn't have a camera. I lived in a very rural area, and our access to technology was very, very limited. The only time that we would see pictures of ourselves or get pictures taken of us was when family members would come and visit us from far away, and they would bring their camera, and we'd have to wait for them to come back on the next trip before we saw those pictures again. Anyway, on this one particular visit, we had family bring a Polaroid camera. And I really thought that was exciting and magical, because you could take a picture and just watch it develop. But there was a lot of anticipation in that moment of watching it develop, right? And that's kind of where we are with XR right now. The future of XR is forming, and we're really just beginning to glimpse what it can do for how we live, how we work, and especially as an educator, how we are learning. My name is Jody Parchment. I'm an XR developer working for OnXr, who is focused on training in the health and life sciences and higher education. I'm also a licensed educator and an edtech entrepreneur, where I've started Dream Steam Labs in hopes of innovating the way that we're learning and advocating for STEAM education, STEAM being science, tech, engineering, art, and mathematics. So I've been working at the intersection of these technologies for the last 5 years, and experiential learning. And I'm really driven by the potential of what XR can do if we reimagine its role as an educational tool. Today, we'll take a look at the role that an early introduction to technology plays in our lives. We'll take a look at a few case studies of how XR is currently being used in learning and expanding upon those possibilities, the challenges that we're seeing in education and why there is such a hesitancy, and then what we can do to help bring innovation. So computers were once new technology, right? When they first came out, there was very limited and early adoption. It was really hardly used for instruction. By 1984, only 8% of public schools had computers inside their classrooms. Maybe 10 years later, we saw that expanding and integrating into the school system. And this is when I was introduced to the computer. And I can say that this has definitely shaped who I am today, because if it wasn't for that early exposure and going on the computer and exploring, I don't know what other direction or path I may have taken. Now let's fast forward to 2025, where we have seen the growth of one-to-one programs where each student has their own computing device. And that's in almost 90% of K-12 schools today. But what this also shows us is that educational systems are more reactive than they are proactive. When COVID started in 2020, there was an absolute need for virtual instruction and for students to have access. And this really pushed the one-on-one programs even more. So again, another instance of the educational system being reactive rather than proactive when adopting this new technology. So think about your journey, whether it's in tech or anywhere else. Think about where you were first introduced to the idea of, like, wow, this is something I want to do. You might remember that curiosity about it. And if you actually learned about it later on in life, like I did with certain things, you might have wished you had been exposed or been introduced to that concept or that technology or whatever it is sooner. But with computers, right, we didn't just learn how to use a computer. We didn't just use it for word processing. We learned how to think with that computer. It was a tool that expanded upon what we were already able to do. So as far as XR in education, as far as XR in general, actually, we've seen varied levels of adoption across industries. But specifically in education, there is stats to back up why this is such a great technology, right? It has 75% higher retention than learning in traditional methods. Not only are they remembering more information, they're also remembering that information for longer, right? And there's also 4 times faster skill acquisition. So they're remembering more, they're remembering longer, and they're learning faster. Now, all of this is really because it connects the theory with the reality. It bridges that gap between what they're learning, all these conceptual things, and what they're actually experiencing. So today, with these stats in mind, we'll take a look at 3 XR case studies in education. That's one in patient education, higher education, and in the K-12 school system. As far as XR and patient-centered education, it has bridged the gap between complex science and real-world understanding. So the lived experience and the science behind that. Take, for example, sickle cell disease. So this is a blood disorder that causes these regularly shaped circular oval blood cells to become sickle-shaped, like what you see in the upper right-hand corner. And because of this, they tend to stick together and they block the flow of the regular blood cells. And this can lead to really serious health concerns that affect a person's quality of life and how long they live. So the real challenge of this was that patients weren't taking beneficial treatment that would solve or treat some of these symptoms that they were experiencing. Now, some of these treatments have been on the markets for decades, and there is ample information about these treatments. However, the patients find them complex, intimidating, and boring, right? Trying to read through all of that information. So my colleagues at Cyberscell came up, my colleagues at OnXr came up with Cyberscell. Now, remember, if you might remember the Magic School Bus when Miss Frizzle would shrink the students down and they would go places they wouldn't normally be able to go or see things they wouldn't normally be able to see. And in essence, this is what Cyberscell does. Imagine you're taken into a 3D blood vessel and you can look around. You can see these healthy and regular shaped blood cells passing you by. You can also see these sickle shaped blood cells passing you by. And you can see them up close. You can see exactly why they're so sticky, exactly why they're sticking together, and exactly how they're causing these blockage of blood flow and causing the pain that the patients are actually experiencing. Right. Not only that, they took it a step further and spoke about the treatments that are available. Right. So now patients can actually see firsthand within this blood vessel how those treatments are actually working and helping to treat some of those symptoms. Now, this was a first of its kind, user-centered, evidence-based experience, and the research has been published in the Journal of Medical Extended Reality just last month. But the team worked with patients rather than just designing for them and iterated on that feedback that they received. And I'll read an impact statement here from a 19-year-old male with sickle cell disease. Just an excerpt. So he said, it's just different when somebody's just telling you versus you actually looking into it. I feel like it's important to take my medication more than I actually do. And this resonated with many of the patients who underwent testing and who have used Cyberscell. So it has empowered sickle cell patients and their caregivers and their clinicians really to make more informed decisions about their care now that they've seen this up close in this immersive and experiential learning space. I'll switch to XR and higher education, where it is bridging the gap between lab technique, and conceptual and abstract and real world understanding. Now, strong lab technique is important, right? Because it reduces waste and that's damage to equipment, and it also ensures safety within the lab, that we're also carrying out the procedures properly. Now, I will speak about two lab techniques, cell culture and centrifugation. They are essential in molecular biology, and essentially they're used to grow, separate, and study living cells, and used very much in research. So it was observed that there was poor lab technique, and this project was developed with Drexel University. So there was this researcher noticed poor technique within the lab by graduate, undergraduate students, and others using the lab. And these accidents were leading to equipment damage, safety risks, and other material waste. So I'm very proud to say I worked as the XR developer on this project, which is still undergoing user testing. But the whole purpose of it was to guide these participants or users through step-by-step training in cell culture and centrifugation. So they're learning or getting re-upping on how do I do this properly? How do I do cell culture properly? How do I use a centrifuge properly? They're immersed in a realistic environment using 360 views and point of view video, right? And there's also an interactive and experience quiz that as they're going through this training, it is testing and assessing their learning progress. In addition to that, we also created an additional module which explores a molecule called trypsin, which is highly and widely used in biology and cell culture. So in addition to learning the techniques, they're also learning about this enzyme that they're using to carry out their procedures. So basically with this, we embedded a lot of visual and interactive cues to guide attention and reinforce conceptual understanding. It lets the users know where to look, and it breaks down this enzyme into its different parts. You can go and highlight the different parts that make up this enzyme. So we're learning about it even more in depth, not just how it's working to separate and grow cells, but actually its composition, right? And this really reimagines engagement with the lab material. And as I said, it is still undergoing user testing, but there's been some really early positive engagement showing some stronger safety habits and reduced waste, right? And of course, improved learner confidence, because now I can step into the lab and know how to carry out these lab techniques, right? And reduce that waste and improve safety. And lastly, and most importantly, being an educator in the K-12 school system, I'm very intrigued by what XR can do in a K-12 student-centered atmosphere, where it is bridging creativity, technology, authentic student learning, and it is really addressing some really major learning principles and allowing collaboration, right? So students are we're trying to reimagine students not just as consumers of this technology, right? They're not just getting or using software that has been designed for their learning. They are also creators. They are designing their own learning experience that, well, they're learning, but they're also going to use that to teach others, right? And they're applying design thinking principles, project-based learning. This is experiential learning. And as I said, it's very collaborative. And there is a level of computational thinking here involved. So my role was I guided students through the development and the real world project management of this initiative. Now, the students said it themselves, and you can see it here. When we were working on coming up with a problem statement that we wanted to create a solution for in VR, they came up with students want new ways to learn in school, in the classroom, in the lab, because technology is changing the world. And the students want to adapt right now, right? So this was a problem statement that inadvertently they were telling us what they wanted, We had to revamp it for the project, right? We had to work towards a new problem statement, which is that users in their community would want to learn about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are there to help promote a more safe, equitable, and sustainable future. So they wanted to teach their community about that in an interactive way, right? So that is the problem statement we landed on. But what their initial problem statement tells us is that this traditional instruction is limiting their creativity. This curriculum is outdated, right? And they're really craving these new ways to learn. And we shouldn't be afraid to engage them with these new tools. So the solution was Welcome to the Boardwalk. This is a student created VR experience that is based on, again, the UN Sustainable Dev Goals, but the students also designed this to be relatable. So they created an environment that is very similar to their to where they live, right? They created a boardwalk. They live by the beach, so the boardwalk is a big attraction in their community. And they wanted something that the community who's learning from this experience would be able to relate to, and then tying in those UN goals back to their community. So, you know, trying not polluting the water, right? Being wary of just garbage. And so, anyway, they went through and picked out some of these 17 out of the 17 goals. They picked a few that they wanted to focus on. And it was developed again by the students at Toms River Regional High School. This was a capstone course, so it was the third course in a series of three for the Digital Arts Academy. And prior to stepping into this course, many of the students did not have any prior exposure to the software or to programming or to digital design per se, right? So we were fortunate enough to have a artist in residence visit us, Frederick Freeman, who visited us and for like about 20 visits throughout the year. And that was through a grant and helped us in our ideation and design thinking process. So as the educator, as I said, I had a very multifaceted role, which involved putting students in teams to work on this, finding out what their interests were, maybe what they were good at already, or what they had some experience in already. And they had to learn how to work together, right? So I had to also teach them how to learn the software. So Unity is what we built with. They had to learn Photoshop and Blender and C Sharp and all the other satellite tools that we use in VR development. And in addition to that, I also had to coordinate with other teachers because this was not just collaborative within the classroom, it was collaborative outside, so amongst other classrooms. And I did coordinate with other teachers in order to come up with a problem statement and overall development of this project, as there were multiple classes working together, not just my class. But overall, the biggest thing that I was a problem solver, right? Having to be flexible, setting those deadlines, and just continuing working towards the goal. The role of the students, of course, is now to use that knowledge that they've been imparted and the foundation that they were given in those tools, those software and digital tools, to create their own assets and their own interactivity for this experience. They went outside and took pictures, which they used as materials and textures. They went through this design thinking process where they use brainstorming and affinity mapping and prototyping to kind of hone in on what they wanted to focus on and to give direction to this project, right? They did some programming, as I said, some storytelling. And I had one student who really went into Blockbench and created this entire arcade scene on his own. It's its own little level that you can go in and explore. And the concept was that this would be a scavenger hunt. And there were 3 items that the users would have to find, and it would teach or promote environmental awareness or the UN goals that they chose to focus on. So one of those things or clues that you had to find was this horticulture guide, right? Which is somewhere within this arcade scene. So that was really cool to see students really coming into their own and finding some things that they liked and discovering new things about themselves, some of their hidden talents. So here I have some pictures from, we had an expo at the end of the school year. And this was a community expo. So it wasn't just within the school, everyone from the community and surrounding communities came to see. And we presented there. And here you can see some students trying it on. We see some adults trying it on. I even had one parent tell me like how proud she was to be able to say that her student, or her child rather, was able to work on this project and be a part of it. And now here they are using it and experiencing it. So this is a little bit of my team here. This is the teacher that I coordinated with, Miss Olexi. This is our visiting artist here, Fred, in this picture in the upper right hand corner, and my supervisor and superintendent and some others who we got the grant through. But this really reinforced their skills and aligned with like future workforce, CTE pathways. This was agile development. They were using so many things. So, right, the best way to learn is to teach others. And that is exactly what they were doing. I can tell you right now, if I ask any of those students who worked on this project what the UN Sustainable Development Goals are, one, they'd tell me overall what it is, and they'd be able to identify some of those UN goals specifically, or especially the ones that we focused on. So this is, again, like the best. It was a really innovative way of them learning. They're learning the software, they're learning XR, they're learning emerging tech, and they're teaching others with that. At the end of this particular class, those students were afforded the opportunity to be certified in Unity. And some of them did go on and take that test and pass and got their Unity artist certification. So that's something that even before they get out of high school, they have that. I do have a little video here. I'll just skip through it really quickly. We can see some of the things. So we went into Mixamo, and maybe the audio isn't picking up. We went into Mixamo and downloaded some of these characters or models and programmed them to walk around. We did some interactivity, picking up like just, it's kind of cool. They had fun with it. And this is the arcade scene here that the student created. And you can go in and you find a ticket, which you can then bring to the machine, and you find one of the clues, all right, one of the clues of this scavenger hunt. We have a beach, and this looks very familiar and similar to the environment or to the boardwalk right there in the community. So people were really amazed to be able to step into this world that the students created, and also just see like their boardwalk in essence, right? So it was a really great experience with really great feedback. So what we can take from this is that XR deeply engages learners. They're learning more, learning faster, remembering it for longer. It's bridging that gap between real world and abstract concepts. And especially in K-12, it's really empowering students, allowing them to use this new technology and feel like they are being prepared for the future, right? But there are a lot of challenges. There are funding limitations. There's a lack of professional development. There's reactive adoption, right? So the idea is that we want to start small, support initiatives in your community. It's important to have that hands-on training, not just, hey, here's a tool, but take the time and the energy to teach, to have professional development available so that it is being used effectively, right? There's no point in having a technology if we're not using it the way that is actually going to help us. So it's important. Let's start our own initiatives, pilot programs, and really in the K-12 school system, there is a big, parents play a big role in pushing for things. And I think sometimes they undermine or don't know the depth of the power that together they can have in affecting change. So overall, to the XR community, to everyone really, let's allow student imagination to build on yours. That same imagination you had when computers first came out or you were first introduced to a certain tech and you were like, wow, imagine what this could do, right? No matter how much we have imagination now, the younger generation has so much more imagination than us. They're living in a different world than us. They can see further even, or be able to imagine it in spaces that we might not even be able to. Don't let the transition take 40 years with like it did with computers. Right now is the time while this is growing and starting, not after it's been set in place and now schools and the school system is trying to play catch up. So it's very important that we invest in K-12 to secure the next wave of innovators who aren't just going to use the tech, but they're also going to be thinking with it. So let's reimagine the role that XR is playing in education. Thank you.
Want to check out more from the AWE Nite Orlando Immersive Intelligence Lab? Watch more talks and presentations from our incredible XR plus AI innovators. Thanks for watching, and please leave a like.
Nite Orlando.